There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. A Tuesday night, a half-empty mug of tea growing cold on a coffee table, the low hum of the city breathing outside your window. They were the camouflage of the mundane, and it's only later, when you trace the map of your own heart backwards, that you see them for what they were, the quiet, unassuming epicenters of seismic change. For me, that moment was the sound of a key turning in a lock that wasn't mine, followed by a silence that was heavier than any words. It was the first night Liam chose my couch over his own empty bed, and in doing so, unknowingly began to dismantle the carefully constructed architecture of the life I had built around the simple, painful fact of loving him in secret. It was a beginning that felt, at the time, perilously close to an end. He had a key because I was a photographer and he was a consultant who traveled, and the logic was simple and practical. I watered his perpetually thirsty snake plant. He grabbed my mail when I was on a location shoot. Our friendship was built on this kind of easy, reciprocal scaffolding. It was a structure I trusted, one with clearly defined boundaries and load-bearing walls I never dared to test. I knew my place within it. I was Alex, the quiet observer, the keeper of his spare key and his casual confidences. He was Liam, the effortless center of gravity in any room, the man whose laughter could rearrange the molecules in the air, the friend I had loved with a silent, hopeless ache for 4 years. The friendship was a precious, fragile ecosystem, and my unspoken feelings were a potentially invasive species I kept ruthlessly quarantined. That night, the call had come just after 11. It was brief, the connection staticky as if the words themselves were struggling to hold together. Sarah had ended it. He didn't say much more, his voice a low, gravelly thing I barely recognized. I had offered the usual platitudes, the hollow architecture of comfort you build for a friend whose pain you can't possibly touch. I'm so sorry, and is there anything I can do, and do you want to talk about it? He had just mumbled something about needing to get out of his apartment, the space suddenly feeling haunted by her absence, every object a testament to a future that had just evaporated. I told him to come over, of course. It was the reflex of our friendship, the well-worn groove of our dynamic. Liam had a crisis. Alex provided the stable ground. But when he arrived, it was different. He didn't knock. He used his key, and the sound of it, that small metallic scrape and tumble, felt like a tectonic shift. It was an act of entry that bypassed permission, an assumption of welcome that was both deeply familiar and suddenly, terrifyingly new. He stood in the doorway of my small apartment, his broad shoulders seeming to shrink within the frame. He looked like a ship that had been torn from its moorings, adrift and taking on water. His usual energy, that bright, restless current that always flowed around him, was gone. In its place was a profound and unnerving stillness. He was holding a single, rumpled pillow, and the sight of it, so domestic and vulnerable, was what finally broke through my own shock. It was a symbol of a need so fundamental it didn't require words. He needed a safe place to land. He didn't speak. He just walked past me, the scent of rain and something defeated clinging to him, and collapsed onto my worn leather sofa. He curled onto his side, facing the back cushions, pulling his knees toward his chest and clutching that pathetic, rumpled pillow. I stood there, my hand still on the doorknob, the cool metal a grounding point in a room that had suddenly tilted on its axis. The space between us, usually filled with easy banter and shared jokes, was now a vast, silent ocean of his grief. I felt like an intruder in my own home, a spectator to a private agony I had no right to witness. Every instinct I had screamed at me to go to him, to put a hand on his back, to offer some physical token of comfort. But I was paralyzed. The quarantine around my heart was suddenly on high alert. Touching him now felt like a transgression, an exploitation of his vulnerability. My comfort would be a lie, tainted by the selfish, secret hope that it might be something more. So I did the only thing I could. I performed the rituals of quiet care. I made him a cup of chamomile tea he would not drink. I placed it on the coffee table, the steam rising like a fragile prayer into the quiet air. I unfolded the thick wool blanket from the back of my armchair and draped it over his still form. His body was tense beneath the weight of it, a knot of muscle and misery. He didn't acknowledge the gesture, but I saw the slight tremor that ran through his shoulders, a surrender to the small warmth. I retreated to the kitchen, busying myself with the meaningless task of wiping down an already clean counter, just to put a necessary distance between us. I was creating a buffer zone, a demilitarized territory where my feelings couldn't launch an assault on his grief. From the corner of my eye, I watched the slow, even rise and fall of his back, a rhythm that gradually replaced the frantic, silent screaming in my own head. He was asleep. That simple fact landed with the force of a revelation. He had sought out my home not just for conversation or distraction, but for oblivion. He had come here to feel safe enough to let go. The thought was a strange mixture of profound honor and sharp, piercing pain. I was his harbor, but a harbor is just a place a ship waits until it's ready to face the sea again. I turned off the main lights, leaving only the soft glow of the small lamp on my desk, the one I used for editing photos late at night. The dim light softened the edges of the room, turning it into a darkroom of sorts, a space of quiet waiting and gentle transformation. I looked at him, his face half buried in the cushion, his dark hair falling over his forehead. In sleep, the tension had eased from his jaw, and he looked younger, more like the man I'd first met 4 years ago, before Sarah, before the carefully constructed walls of our friendship had been fully erected. It was a face I knew better than my own, a landscape I had studied for years from a safe distance. Seeing it now, so unguarded in my own living room, felt like sacrilege. It was an intimacy I hadn't earned, and it terrified me. I went to my bedroom, closed the door, and lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of his breathing through the thin wall, a quiet metronome marking the time of a world that had fundamentally, irrevocably changed. Our friendship hadn't begun with a bang, but with the slow, comfortable burn of mutual recognition. We met at a backyard barbecue hosted by a mutual colleague. It was one of those sprawling, late summer affairs where the air was thick with citronella and forced mingling. I was never good at those events. I tended to find a quiet corner, nursing a beer and observing people, framing them in my mind as potential portraits, a habit that kept me at a comfortable remove. Liam was the opposite. He was holding court near the grill, a spatula in one hand and a beer in the other, telling some animated story that had a small constellation of people orbiting him, laughing at all the right moments. He was bright and loud and effortlessly charming, everything I wasn't. He was the sun. I was the quiet planetoid in a far-flung, forgotten orbit. I had no expectation of ever speaking to him, and I was fine with that. But later in the evening, as the crowd thinned and the sky bruised into twilight, he broke away from his admirers and wandered over to my solitary perch on the edge of the deck. He wasn't looking at me, but at the old, gnarled oak tree at the edge of the yard. "The light's perfect on that," he said, his voice softer than I'd expected. "The way it's catching the leaves." I was so surprised he was talking to me that I almost didn't answer. I followed his gaze. He was right. The setting sun was firing through the canopy, turning the leaves into 1,000 tiny panes of stained glass. It was a photographer's observation. "It is," I finally managed to say. "It's called the golden hour." He turned to me then, and his smile wasn't the broad, performative one he'd been using earlier. It was smaller, more genuine. "You're a photographer, aren't you?" Mark told me. "Alex, right." I nodded, my own name sounding foreign in his mouth. We talked for the next hour, not about work or the weather or any of the other usual party fillers, but about light. About the way it could change the mood of a room, the way it could reveal or conceal, the way a single, well-placed shadow could tell a whole story. It was the first time I had ever met someone who wasn't a fellow photographer who understood the language of light as an emotional medium. He was a software consultant, he told me, someone who dealt in logic and code, but he saw the world with an artist's eye. It was a contradiction that fascinated me instantly. From there, a friendship bloomed with an ease that felt preordained. We fell into a comfortable rhythm of weekly dinners, late-night movies, and long, aimless walks through the city. I learned the topography of him, his fierce loyalty, his restlessness, his surprising vulnerability. He was the one who pushed me to submit my work to galleries, who showed up to my first small exhibition with a bottle of champagne and a grin so proud it made my chest ache. I was the one he called when a project went sideways, the one who could listen to him vent about buggy code and impossible deadlines for hours, offering quiet, steady support. Our friendship became a foundational structure in my life, a home I had built for myself without realizing it. And somewhere in the midst of building that home, I had fallen in love with him. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic event. It was a slow, creeping dawn. It was in the way my stomach would flip when he'd casually drape an arm over the back of my chair. It was in the way I'd find myself saving articles or funny pictures specifically to send to him, just for the thrill of his response. It was in the sharp, physical pang of jealousy I felt when he first told me about Sarah. He'd met her about a year into our friendship, and they'd clicked instantly. She was lovely, smart, funny, and beautiful, a perfect match for his bright energy. I liked her genuinely, and I hated myself for the small, ugly part of me that resented her for having what I could never even ask for. So I built walls. My feelings were a secret city, hidden behind a carefully maintained facade of platonic affection. I became an expert in emotional misdirection. I learned to smile when he talked about his future with her. I offered relationship advice I felt like a hypocrite for giving. I became the perfect, supportive friend, all while a silent civil war raged within me. The friendship was too important to risk. The thought of his rejection was one thing, but the thought of his discomfort, of him looking at me differently, of our easy camaraderie curdling into awkwardness, that was unbearable. Losing the friendship would be a far greater devastation than the quiet, chronic pain of my unrequited love. So I chose the pain. I chose to remain the quiet observer, the keeper of his spare key, the safe harbor. I resigned myself to a life lived in the shadow of my own feelings, a constant state of loving him from a distance that was both agonizingly close and impossibly far. The architecture was set. The boundaries were clear. I knew the rules. Until the night he showed up at my door, clutching a pillow, and the first rule was broken. He wasn't supposed to need me like that. Not in a way that bled past the neat lines of friendship into something raw and undefined. His grief over Sarah should have sent him to other friends, to his family. But he had come to me. He had used his key. He had fallen asleep on my couch. And in doing so, he had placed a charge at the base of the walls I had so carefully constructed, and I had no idea if they would survive the blast. The breakup with Sarah wasn't a clean break. It was a slow, messy demolition. It plunged Liam into a state I'd never seen him in before. The bright, confident energy that had always defined him seemed to dim, like a powerful lighthouse succumbing to a thick, disorienting fog. He was adrift, and my apartment became his unofficial, unspoken sanctuary. The first night set the precedent for what would become a new, unnerving ritual. He didn't go home. He woke up on my couch the next morning, his hair a mess, a deep crease from the leather imprinted on his cheek. He looked disoriented, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings before they landed on me, standing in the kitchen doorway with 2 mugs of coffee. "Morning," I said, my voice carefully neutral. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his hair. "God, Alex, I'm so sorry. I crashed." "It's fine," I said, and it was the biggest lie I'd told all week. It wasn't fine. Having him here, rumpled and sleep-soft in the morning light, was a specific kind of torture. It was a glimpse into a domestic fantasy I had no right to entertain. I handed him a mug, our fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a jolt of static that shot up my arm. I pulled back as if burned. He didn't seem to notice, his attention focused on the steam rising from the coffee. That day became the template. He would go to work from my apartment, shower, borrow a shirt. He'd come back in the evening, ostensibly to pick up his things, but we'd end up ordering takeout, putting on a movie he wouldn't watch, and he'd fall asleep on the couch again. It happened twice the first week, 4 times the second. He always had a reason, a piece of plausible deniability that we both tacitly agreed to accept. His apartment was too quiet. He was working late, and my place was closer. He didn't want to be alone. Each excuse was a thin veil over the truth we were both avoiding. He was seeking a comfort that had nothing to do with proximity or convenience. He was seeking me. The couch was our unspoken boundary, the 3-seater no man's land. But one night, about a month into this new arrangement, the boundary shifted. It was a miserable, rain-lashed Tuesday. The wind was rattling the window panes, and the city felt hunkered down and grim. Liam had been quiet all evening, a heavy, brooding presence in the room. He'd barely touched his food, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the walls of my apartment. I could feel the waves of his unhappiness rolling off him, and the urge to do something, anything, was overwhelming. Around midnight, I got up to go to bed. "You can take the couch, as usual," I said, the phrase already worn smooth with repetition. He looked up at me, and his eyes were dark, filled with a loneliness so vast it felt like it could swallow the whole room. "Alex," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "Your couch is terrible." I blinked, thrown by the sudden, mundane complaint. "It's a perfectly good couch." "It's not," he insisted, a flicker of his old stubbornness surfacing. "It's lumpy, and my feet hang off the end. I haven't had a decent night's sleep in a month." I stood there, unsure of what he was asking. The air between us was suddenly thick with unspoken possibilities. My bedroom door was open behind me, a rectangle of darkness that felt like a portal to a different world. My heart started to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was it. This was a crossroads. I could offer him more blankets, an extra pillow. I could maintain the boundary, or I could open the gate. "You can. You can take the bed," I heard myself say, the words feeling like they were being pulled from me. "I can take the couch." He shook his head, a quick, decisive motion. "No, that's your bed. I'm not kicking you out of your own bed." He paused, and the silence stretched, taut and shimmering. "It's a big bed," he finally said, not as a statement, but as a question. It hung in the air between us, fragile and terrifying. He wasn't looking at me, but at his hands, as if he couldn't bear to see my reaction. My entire world narrowed to that single, loaded question. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to say no, to retreat to the safety of the established rules. Sharing a bed was not something friends did. It was an act of intimacy that couldn't be explained away by bad weather or a lumpy couch. It was a line, and crossing it meant there was no going back. But then I looked at him, at the slump of his shoulders, at the profound weariness in his posture, and the walls I had so carefully built began to crumble. His need was a tide, and it was washing away all my defenses. "Okay," I whispered. The word was barely audible, but it landed in the quiet room with the force of a gavel. "Okay." He looked up, and for a second, I saw a flicker of relief in his eyes, so quick I might have imagined it. He didn't say anything else. He just stood up, and together we walked into the bedroom. The entire act felt surreal, like we were moving through a dream. I gave him a t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants to sleep in, and we changed in a studiously polite silence, each of us turning our backs to the other. The space felt charged, every small sound amplified. The rustle of fabric, the soft thud of shoes on the floor. Getting into the bed was the most self-conscious act of my life. I stayed as far to my side as possible, my body rigid, a hair's breadth from the edge of the mattress. I could feel the dip in the bed as he got in on the other side, the slight shift of weight as he settled. The space between us was a chasm, a gulf of unspoken tension. But it was also a space filled with the heat of his body, a warmth that seemed to radiate across the sheets, seeking me out. I lay there, my back to him, my eyes wide open in the dark, every nerve ending firing. I could hear him breathing, a slow, steady rhythm that was so much closer than it had been through the wall. I must have been lying there for an hour, my muscles aching with tension, when I felt a slight movement behind me. I braced myself, my heart seizing. Then, I felt a tentative pressure against my back. He had rolled over. His knees were now gently pressing against the back of mine. His arm was thrown over the space between us, the back of his hand resting against my shoulder blade. It was the most casual of touches, the kind of unconscious contact that happens in sleep. But it wasn't. He wasn't asleep. I could feel the tension in his body, the same rigid stillness that was in my own. This was a deliberate act, disguised as an accident. He was building a bridge across the chasm. And I did nothing to stop him. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I just lay there, barely breathing, and let it happen. I let the warmth of him seep into me. It was terrifying, and it was the most profoundly comforting thing I had ever felt. It was a silent conversation. He was asking for something he couldn't name, and with my stillness, I was giving him an answer. After another long, silent eternity, I felt the tension in his body finally begin to release. His breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of genuine sleep. And only then did I allow myself to relax, my own body slumping in relief. I stayed awake long after he was asleep, a sentinel guarding this fragile, terrifying new intimacy. The rain had stopped, and the city outside was quiet. In the stillness of my small bedroom, a new ritual had been born, one that was infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more hopeful than the last. We were no longer on opposite sides of a wall. We were in the same room, in the same bed, and the door had just been closed behind us. The ritual of the bed became our new, unspoken normal. It was a territory we navigated with a strange, silent choreography. There was no more discussion, no more pretense about lumpy couches. When it grew late, he would simply follow me to the bedroom. We maintained the fiction of our separate sides, the careful distance, but every night, in the deep quiet of the dark, the bridge would be rebuilt. He would roll over, and his body would seek out mine. A hand on my back, a knee pressed against my leg. Sometimes, his arm would drape over my waist, his fingers resting lightly on my hip. Each touch was a quiet question, and my stillness was always the answer. My nights became a study in hyper-awareness. I was a seismologist, my body the instrument, registering the slightest tremors of his. I learned the subtle shifts in his breathing that signaled his descent into sleep. I learned the weight of his arm, the specific warmth of his skin through the thin cotton of our t-shirts. My world, which I had so carefully curated to keep him at a safe emotional distance, had now shrunk to the dimensions of my queen-sized mattress. And in this small, confined space, every feeling I had ever tried to suppress was amplified, echoing in the silence between our heartbeats. It was an exquisite form of torture. I would lie awake for hours, my body rigid with a mixture of terror and a joy so potent it was painful. I was so close to everything I had ever wanted, and yet it was all built on a foundation of ambiguity, a shared denial we were both too afraid to challenge. During the day, we would pretend it wasn't happening. We'd make coffee, talk about work, fall back into the easy rhythm of our friendship as if we hadn't just spent 8 hours entangled in a web of unspoken intimacy. It was a cognitive dissonance that was starting to wear me down. I felt like I was living two lives, the daytime life of Alex, the supportive friend, and the nighttime life of Alex, the silent keeper of a shared secret. I started to see the strain on him, too. There were moments when he would look at me, a flicker of confusion or something deeper in his eyes, before he would quickly look away. He stopped talking about Sarah altogether. His grief, which had been the catalyst for this whole shift, seemed to have been replaced by a different kind of turmoil, one that was quieter but somehow more profound. He was a man wrestling with a ghost, but I was no longer sure it was hers. My photography became my only outlet, the only place I could process the silent chaos of my inner world. My darkroom was my sanctuary, a place where I could bring images out of darkness, just as I was trying to understand the feelings developing between us. I started a new series of self-portraits. They were abstract, close-up shots of my own skin, the back of my neck, my hands, the places where he touched me at night. I used long exposures, blurring the images until they were just impressions of warmth and pressure, ghosts of contact. I was trying to capture the feeling of being touched without being held, of being yearned for without being claimed. The images were raw and vulnerable, a visual diary of my own longing. The breaking point, the moment the unspoken tension finally erupted into the world of noise and consequence, came on a Saturday night in October. A few of our mutual friends had insisted we all go out for drinks. I had been reluctant, content to stay within the safe bubble of my apartment, but Liam, in a rare burst of his old energy, had been insistent. He said we needed a normal night out. I knew he was right. We couldn't live in our strange, two-person ecosystem forever. We had to pretend we were still just friends, not just for ourselves, but for everyone else. The bar was crowded and loud, the air thick with perfume and the thumping bass of some forgettable pop song. It was the antithesis of the quiet world we had built. I felt immediately on edge, the noise of physical assault after weeks of hushed intimacy. Liam, however, seemed to slip back into his old skin with ease. He was laughing, ordering rounds, easily charming the bartender. Watching him, I felt a familiar pang of distance. This was the Liam everyone else knew, the bright, social son. The quiet, vulnerable man who curled up against me in the dark was my secret, and seeing him so effortlessly public felt like a betrayal, even though I knew it was irrational. I was standing by the edge of our group, nursing a beer, when a guy I didn't know detached himself from the bar and approached me. He was conventionally handsome in a bland sort of way, with an overconfident smile and eyes that roamed over me with a cool, appraising gaze. "I don't think I've seen you here before," he said, his voice pitched to be heard over the music. I gave him a polite, non-committal smile, hoping he would take the hint. He did not. He moved closer, invading my personal space, and launched into a monologue about his job, his car, his recent trip to Cancun. I was a master of the polite fade-out, but he was relentless. I kept glancing over at my friends, at Liam, hoping for an escape route. Liam was watching. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. His smile was gone. He was standing with his arms crossed, his body angled towards me, his jaw tight. He wasn't part of the conversation he was supposedly in. His entire attention was a laser beam fixed on me and the guy who was now leaning in, his hand coming to rest on the small of my back. The touch was unwelcome, proprietary, and I stiffened, about to pull away and make my excuses. But I never got the chance. In the space of a heartbeat, Liam had crossed the 10 feet that separated us. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed the guy's wrist, his grip like iron, and pulled his hand off my back. The guy recoiled, surprised and angry. "What the hell, man?" he snarled. Liam's face was a mask of cold fury I had never seen before. It was terrifying. "Don't touch him," Liam said, his voice dangerously low. The guy, buoyed by alcohol and arrogance, just laughed. "And who are you? His boyfriend?" he sneered, turning his attention back to me. "You into the possessive type." And then it happened. Liam punched him. It wasn't a wild, clumsy swing. It was short, fast, and brutal. A solid crack echoed in the momentary lull in the music, and the guy staggered back, his hand flying to his jaw, his eyes wide with shock. The entire bar seemed to go silent for a second. Everyone was staring. 2 bouncers were immediately moving toward us, their faces grim. Liam stood over the guy, his chest heaving, his knuckles already starting to swell. He looked down at his own hand, and then at the man on the floor, and then, finally, at me. The fury in his eyes was gone, replaced by a look of utter, profound shock, as if he couldn't comprehend what he had just done. Our friends were suddenly there, pulling him back, talking in low, urgent voices to the bouncers. I was frozen, my own beer forgotten in my hand. The guy was being helped up, swearing and threatening, but the bouncers were efficient, escorting him towards the door. Someone grabbed my arm, our friend Maya. "Alex, are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. I couldn't answer. All I could see was Liam's face. He was being steered towards the exit by our friend Ben, but his eyes were locked on mine. They were filled with a wild, desperate confusion. We were hustled out into the cool night air. The sudden quiet was deafening. Ben was trying to calm Liam down, who was just shaking his head over and over again. I'm fine, he kept muttering, but he was pale, his breathing still ragged. Our friends were buzzing, a confused and anxious flock. What was that about? I've never seen him do that. Is that guy going to call the cops? I pushed through them and walked over to Liam. He stopped shaking his head and just stared at me, his expression haunted. "Liam," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Why?" He looked at me, and his face crumpled. It was the look of a man who had just seen his own reflection for the first time and hadn't recognized the person staring back. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked down at his throbbing hand, then back at my face, and the words he finally spoke were the most devastating and hopeful things I had ever heard. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice cracking with bewilderment. "Alex, I don't know why I did that." He didn't know. He had acted on an impulse so deep, so fundamental, that his conscious mind hadn't even caught up yet. It was an act of pure, primal possession, an act of jealousy, an act of love, in its most brutish, unthinking form. He had crossed a line far more definitive than sharing a bed. He had declared, in the most public and violent way possible, that I was his. And he didn't even know why. The plausible deniability we had both been hiding behind was shattered. The quiet, ambiguous world of our apartment had just collided with the real one, and the wreckage was all around us. The aftermath was a landscape of brittle silence and frantic avoidance. The walk home from the bar was the longest 10 blocks of my life. Our friends, sensing the charged atmosphere, had peeled off one by one with awkward goodbyes, leaving Liam and me to walk the last few blocks alone. He kept his injured hand stuffed in his pocket, his shoulders hunched against more than just the autumn chill. He wouldn't look at me. The space between us on the sidewalk felt wider and more impassable than the chasm in my bed ever had. The man who had defended me with such shocking violence was now terrified to even meet my eyes. When we reached my building, he stopped at the main door. I should probably go home, he mumbled to the pavement. It was the first time in over a month he had suggested it. The rejection was a physical blow, sharp and stunning. After everything, after the nightly ritual, after the punch that had laid his feelings bare for the whole world to see, he was retreating. He was running. A cold, bitter anger began to curdle in my stomach, overriding the shock and the fear. No, I said, my voice harder than I intended. You're not going anywhere. He finally looked up, his eyes wide and startled. Get upstairs, Liam, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. I unlocked the door and held it open, waiting. For a long moment, he hesitated, a man caught between the instinct to flee and the force of my command. Then, with a defeated sigh, he walked past me into the lobby. We rode the elevator up in suffocating silence. The air was thick with everything we weren't saying. The punch, the guy, the look on his face, the words I don't know. Inside my apartment, the quiet was even more profound. He stood awkwardly in the middle of the living room, a stranger in the space that had become his second home. I went into the bathroom and came back with the first aid kit. I took his hand out of his pocket. His knuckles were swollen and split, a dark purple already beginning to bloom under the skin. He flinched when I touched him, but he didn't pull away. I led him to the couch he had abandoned weeks ago, and sat him down. I knelt on the floor in front of him, cleaning the cuts with an antiseptic wipe. He hissed in pain, his eyes squeezed shut. You're an idiot, I said softly, my anger giving way to a weary sadness. I know, he whispered, his voice thick. I worked in silence for a few minutes, carefully wrapping his hand in gauze. My hands were steady, a photographer's hands, accustomed to delicate, precise work. But inside I was shaking. This was an intimacy of a different kind. Not the soft, ambiguous comfort of the night, but the harsh, clinical reality of tending to a wound he had gotten because of me. When I was finished, I sat back on my heels and looked at him. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped in shame. Talk to me, Liam, I said. Please. No more I don't know, I deserve more than that. He took a deep, shuddering breath. I really don't, he started, but I cut him off. Try, I insisted. What were you thinking? What were you feeling when you saw him touch me? He was silent for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. He just stared at his bandaged hand as if it belonged to someone else. It was like a switch flipped. He finally said, his voice barely audible. I was just watching you, and you looked uncomfortable. And then he put his hand on you. And it was like everything went red. It wasn't thought. It was just this roar in my head. It was just mine. Don't touch. He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading confusion. Does that make any sense? It sounds crazy. I'm not a violent person, Alex. You know that. I've never hit anyone in my life. Mine. I repeated the word, my own voice a whisper. The sound of it hung in the air between us, a confession he hadn't even realized he'd made. I don't understand it, he continued, his voice cracking. He ran his good hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. Ever since the breakup with Sarah, everything's been weird. Being at my place felt wrong, but being here, it felt right. It felt quiet. And sleeping here. God, Alex, he broke off, shaking his head. Lying next to you is the only time my brain shuts up. It's the only time I feel settled. And tonight, seeing that guy, it was like he was trying to take that away. He was trying to take you away. And I broke. There it was. Not a neat, tidy declaration of love, but a raw, messy, terrified confession of need. He wasn't in love with me, not in a way he could name or understand yet. He was just gravitationally, instinctually, drawn to me. I was his quiet. I was his settled. I was his. The anger I had felt was gone, washed away by a wave of overwhelming, painful empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of his own feelings, of the person he was becoming. I stood up and sat on the couch next to him, leaving a careful foot of space between us. Liam, I said gently, what are you so afraid of? Of this, he said, gesturing vaguely at the space between us, at the apartment, at his bandaged hand. Of what this means. Of what I'm feeling. It's not. It's not what I thought my life was. I loved Sarah. I was going to marry her. And now, all I want is to fall asleep next to you. And I get into a fight because some guy hits on you. What is that? Who am I? He was a man whose entire map of the world had been rendered useless. He was lost, and he was scared. And in his fear, he was pushing me away, the one person who was his only true north. I closed the distance between us. I took his face in my hands, my thumbs gently stroking his cheekbones. His skin was damp, and I realized he was crying, silent tears tracking down his face. Hey, I whispered. Look at me. He opened his eyes, and they were swimming with fear and confusion and a vulnerability so profound it took my breath away. You're just you, I said softly. You're the same man who brought me champagne at my first gallery show. You're the same man who listens to me talk about f-stops for hours. You're my friend. I paused, my own heart hammering against my ribs. It was now or never. The final wall had to come down. And maybe you're something more. And maybe that's not something to be afraid of. His breath hitched. He stared at me, his gaze searching my face, looking for what? Permission? An answer? His eyes dropped to my lips, and the entire world seemed to stop. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a decade's worth of unspoken words and unfulfilled longing. Alex, he whispered, his voice wrecked. It was a question. It was a plea. It was a surrender. And this time, I was the one who crossed the line. I leaned in and I kissed him. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss. It was the softest, most tentative kiss of my life. It was a question. It was an answer. It was a promise. It was just a gentle pressure of my lips against his, a silent communication that said, it's okay. I'm here. I'm not scared. For a second. He was completely still, frozen in surprise. And then, I felt him melt. A shudder ran through his entire body, a release of tension so profound it was like watching a dam break. His hand came up, the uninjured one, and tangled in the hair at the back of my neck, holding me there. He kissed me back, and his kiss was clumsy and wet with tears, and it was the most honest, beautiful thing I had ever experienced. It wasn't about desire, not yet. It was about recognition. It was about homecoming. It was the feeling of two lost ships finally finding the same safe harbor, in the dark, after a long and terrifying storm. We broke apart, resting our foreheads together, both of us breathing as if we'd just run a marathon. Oh, he breathed out, a sound of pure, dawning realization. Oh, it's you. Yeah, I whispered back, a smile finally breaking through on my own face. It's me. The new world we woke up to was quiet. It wasn't the tense, watchful quiet of the weeks before, but a soft, peaceful silence, the kind that settles after a fever breaks. We hadn't talked much more after the kiss. Words felt inadequate, clumsy tools for the delicate, new architecture we were building. Instead, I had led him to the bedroom, and for the first time, there was no pretense. We got into bed, and he turned to me immediately, wrapping his arms around me and burying his face in my neck. He held on to me as if I was the only solid thing in a spinning world, and I held him back just as tightly. There was no chasm, no bridge, no unspoken negotiation. There was only us. We fell asleep like that, tangled together, his bandaged hand resting gently on my chest, a strange and tender trophy from the battle he had fought with himself and won. Morning came, and with it, a gentle, hesitant light that filled the room. I woke first, my body still wrapped in his. His breathing was a slow, even puff of warm air against my skin. I lay there for a long time, just watching him, memorizing the peace on his face. The confusion and fear from the night before were gone, smoothed away by sleep and the simple, profound relief of acceptance. He looked like himself again, but a version of himself I had only ever seen in brief, stolen glances. He looked home. The word echoed in my mind. He had said that being next to me felt like being settled, and I finally understood. It wasn't about my apartment, or my couch, or my bed. It was about me. I was his home. The realization was so immense, so overwhelming. It felt like my heart might actually burst from the sheer, unadulterated joy of it. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They found mine immediately, and a slow, cautious smile spread across his face. It was a sunrise. Hey, he whispered, his voice husky with sleep. Hey, you, I whispered back, my own smile feeling wide enough to split my face. How's the hand? He glanced down at the gauze on his fist, then back at me. Stupid, he said, but there was no heat in it. But worth it, I think. His smile widened, losing its caution. He leaned in and kissed me again, a slow, deep, morning kiss that tasted of sleep and certainty. It was a kiss that said good morning, and I'm still here, and this is real. Getting out of bed felt like leaving a sacred space, but we did. We made coffee, moving around each other in the small kitchen with an easy, new choreography. There was no awkwardness, no return to the facade of friendship. We were something else now, and we were learning the steps together. He would come up behind me while I was waiting for the coffee to brew and wrap his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. I would lean back into him, my hand covering his, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The simple domesticity of it was staggering. These were the moments I had played out in my head 1,000 times, the painful, impossible daydreams. And now they were real. They were happening. We sat on the couch, the same couch where this whole journey had begun, our legs tangled together, sipping our coffee. We should talk, he said, his tone serious but not anxious. I nodded. Okay, I'm sorry, he said, looking me straight in the eye. For being such a mess. For being so confusing. For punching a guy in a bar. For everything. You had a lot to figure out, I said, my voice gentle. You were allowed to be a mess. I was just so scared, he admitted, his gaze dropping to his mug. My whole life, I had this picture of what it was supposed to look like. A wife, a house, the whole thing. And I thought I had it. I thought I loved Sarah that way. And I did, I think. But it was a comfortable love. It was a love that fit the picture. And then it was gone, and I was completely lost. And I came here, he looked up at me, his eyes full of a dawning wonder. And being with you, it didn't fit the picture at all. It was something new. It was quiet and real, and it felt more right than anything else ever has. And that terrified me, because it meant the picture was wrong. It meant I was wrong about everything I thought I wanted. You're not wrong, I said, reaching out and taking his uninjured hand. You just had the wrong picture. He squeezed my hand, a small, grateful smile on his face. I think I've been in love with you for a long time, Alex, he said, the words coming out with a kind of surprised discovery, as if he was saying them for the first time and only just realizing their truth. I think I just didn't have the language for it. I just knew that my world was better when you were in it. I just knew that you were my person. I just didn't know what that meant. My heart did that familiar, painful flip, but this time, it wasn't followed by the ache of hopelessness. It was followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated peace. I knew, I confessed, my voice soft. I've known for years. His eyes widened in surprise. Years? Why didn't you ever say anything? I shrugged, a small, self-deprecating gesture. Because of the picture. You were happy. And our friendship. Liam, I would have done anything not to lose our friendship. You could never lose me, he said, his voice thick with emotion, and his conviction was so absolute, so unshakable, that I believed him. You idiot. All that time we could have had. We have it now, I said, and that was the only thing that mattered. The days that followed were a study in gentle discovery. We were mapping a new country, a territory that belonged only to us. The grand, terrifying questions had been answered, and now we were left with the small, beautiful details. We learned that he liked to have his back scratched while he was falling asleep. I learned that he made the best pancakes I had ever tasted. He learned that I hummed, completely unconsciously, when I was editing photos. We fell into a rhythm that felt both brand new and anciently familiar. He didn't go back to his apartment, except to pack a bag. His perpetually thirsty snake plant came to live on my windowsill. His key was no longer for emergencies, it was for coming home. Our life wasn't a grand, sweeping romance. It was quiet. It was small, domestic moments strung together like pearls. It was him reading on the couch while I worked in the darkroom, the comfortable silence a language in itself. It was me waking up in the middle of the night and finding him watching me, a soft, wondering look on his face. It was holding hands while we walked down the street, a simple, public declaration that no longer required violence to be understood. The love I had kept quarantined for so long was finally free, not as an invasive species, but as the native, essential flora of my own heart's landscape. It had been there all along, just waiting for the right conditions to bloom. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. But there are other moments, moments of quiet grace, that arrive exactly as they are. A sunrise, a shared cup of coffee, a hand held in the dark. The journey to get there had been a seismic upheaval, a complete demolition of the world I thought I knew. But what we built in its place was infinitely stronger, infinitely more honest. It was a home built not on a picture of what life should be, but on the simple, undeniable truth of what it was. It was built on the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, a silence that was no longer about what was unsaid, but about what no longer needed to be said at all. We had found our language. We had found our way home.